how does a nation that essentially gave birth to human rights have become known as a theocratic state and is accused of, being the source of state-sponsored terrorism and other things? It's kind of have had a bad reputation over the
It
past.
has, yes, yes, yes. So when I talk about insecurities, when you're a young kid who grows up in Canada and like everything with Iran is either the US embassy hostage taking, or like movies like Not Without My Daughter. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. So let's talk about that. We'll try to kind of cover that in the next 40 minutes or so. But you got to start with Iran's history. So when you hear cradle of civilization, you're thinking of modern day Iraq, right? So before, like a couple thousand years before Christ, you had like the Babylonian Empire and all this. And around the year 1000 before Christ, roughly, you had really in what is modern day Iran. Now, greater Iran, sometimes some of the people we're talking about could technically come from modern day Afghanistan or other places, but we'll try to keep it pretty general so we don't lose the flow. So about 1,000 years before Christ, you had an individual named in Farsi Zarathustra. The Greeks would call him Zarathustra, and in English we call him Zoroaster. But Zoroaster or Zarathustra was really the first prophet, so to speak. Well, not necessarily the first prophet, but like he was a very influential individual, one of the first prophets, but he basically founded Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, and I always go, I've written an article about how entrepreneurs today, we associate them with like technology founders, but throughout history, the prophets and their disciples were the original entrepreneurs, the intrapreneurs. These were people that I always say, look at the landscape, the macro environment, and whether you believe in divine revelation or, spirituality or whatever, to each their own. Zarathustra basically kind of came up with this duality of good versus evil. The sins and virtues that, in Christianity you talked about are all rooted in this concept of good versus evil in Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism, a lot of people oversimplified with like the credo, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And it kind of pushes that. It pushes that like you as an individual on this planet, you will be tempted by evil. But you ultimately try to do good, act, in a positive way. And then this concept of Judgment Day, when, Ahura Mazda, the one creator, clashes against Angra Mainyu, who's like the devil, basically. And growing up, I kind of was obviously interested in history. So, I found that it was actually not a monotheistic religion. It's actually polytheistic, if you think about it. But there is one creator, and that is the concept of monotheistic religions later on. And I kind of like, I used to read things that would put Zoroaster much further back in history, but it's generally accepted that he lived sometime between 1,000 to 600 before Christ. And that would make him like a contemporary of, let's say, the Hebrew patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who all kind of were contemporaries, so to speak. And in any case, Zoroaster will go down as one of the most influential people in history because his thoughts, or the divine revelation, if you believe in that, ultimately paved the way for Christianity, Judaism, as well as Islam, all monotheistic religions.
Who would you rank as the next most influential Iranians in history after Zoroaster?
Well, actually, I would put, you could make the argument that Zoroaster is the most influential Iranian of all time because his preachings ultimately influenced the 2 billion Muslims, the 15 or 16 million Jewish people, and the billions of Christians. I actually think the most influential Iranian of all time is Cyrus the Great, Kurosh Bozorg. Most of what we know about Cyrus is actually through Greek historians. So this is Cyropedia, The Education of Cyrus by Xenophon. We put Cyrus the Great #1 in our influential Iranians of all time. And the reason is simple. At the time, So Cyrus the Great was in the 6th century before Christ, a couple of centuries before Alexander the Great. Cyrus started the First World Empire. Now, some of this I've always said as a history guy is just so happens that Cyrus came along when there was a lot of tribes and a lot of local groups, nomads and sedentary, and he kind of really started to build an empire through diplomacy. He was very much like a think global, act local kind of guy. So he would basically go up to people who were usually under the rule of some sovereign, some ruler, some king, some warlord, whatever, who was probably not a very fair and just ruler. And so he would kind of actually get, without ever having to spill blood, although he did, like all others, also fight, he was really more of a diplomat. So he would kind of show people like a better way where they could kind of speak their local language, pray to whoever god. A lot of people know Cyrus in the Torah. He is referenced as freeing the Jews and letting them go back to Jerusalem to build their temple. So Cyrus the Great, even if the West kind of muddies Iran and slanders all of that, Cyrus the Great influenced the Romans. He influenced the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Alexander the Great. Stay on this for a second. And Cyrus the Great also influenced the philosophes français, Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, all those guys, as well as the Thomas Jefferson. So even I, as a kid who grew up in Iran, left at like the age of 5, went to Spain for a year, came to Canada, kind of turned my back on Iran and kind of like renounced everything for better or worse at first. The people that I read about, whether it was Alexander or whether it was Thomas Jefferson, they were all influenced by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus's cylinder was the first declaration of human rights. So I would say Cyrus the Great is probably the most influential Iranian of all time. And, when we talk about the prophets being the first entrepreneurs, so to speak, the kings and commanders were then the next wave. And today, when you look at like the most wealthiest people, it's generally business owners. But at the time, well, yeah, if you ruled over an empire, Cyrus started the first empire, the Persian Empire, by merging the Persian and Mede Empire and creating the Achaemenid Empire. They were the wealthiest of all time. And the interesting thing about Iran is not just that it was like next to the original cradle of civilization, but just geographically, yes, we think of North America as the center of the world, but Iran was pretty much the center of the world because it kind of connected like Europe with Far East Asia, right? It connected Africa to Russia, so to speak. And so whoever that ruled over Iran, whether Cyrus the Great or Kuroshibozorg or eventually Genghis Khan and eventually, well, before Alexander the Great, was always the wealthiest person in the world because Iran had tons of, riches, so to speak. So yeah, I would say that like his influence permeates quite a bit on Western thought, the same way that Zoroaster's beliefs ended up influencing all these other religions.